Welcome to the Regulation Podcast from the Institute of Regulation. My name is Martial Bou, Chair of the Institute and a regulator myself. Now, regulation is one of those words which can make some people's eyes glaze over. It might not sound exciting. That doesn't apply to listeners of this podcast, of course. But today's podcast is certainly for us regulation geeks, as it focuses on the methodology used by regulators, how they regulate, and how the way they regulate has changed over time. And we'll also discuss the future for new approaches to regulating effectively. We're aiming for an authoritative discussion, but also explaining any jargon as we go through, so don't worry. And we might even make regulation sound exciting. So here to tell us more about regulatory methodologies are two people who know both the theory and the practice. On the practitioner side, Alan Clamp is the Chief Executive of the Professional Standards Authority for Health and Social Care, as well as a board member at the Intellectual Property Regulation Board and an advisor to the Bar Standards Board and Ofqual. He's worked for 25 years in regulation and has also been the Chief Executive of the Security Industry Authority and the Human Tissue Authority. And he's on the board of the Institute of Regulation. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you, Martial. Good to be here.
And to help us on the theory, we have Dr. Martin de Bree. And Martin is a lecturer at the Rotterdam School of Management at the Erasmus University in the Netherlands. He's published widely on regulation, with his main research focus on the effectiveness of regulation and law systems and the interface between public and private parties with regard to law and regulation. It's good to have you here too, Martin.
Thank you for having me, Marshall.
Right, with those introductions over, let's start with the past. Now, historically, regulation has often been thought of as negative and punitive, with inspectors coming on site with their clipboards to examine whether professionals and businesses are complying with the rules in a kind of command and control top-down way, focused more on punishing the bad than praising the good. So, do you agree, Martin and Alan, that this is regulation's reputation and it's based on past practice? Martin, let me start with you.
I guess it is. Deterrence is still a very important principle in traditional regulation, I would say, based on the assumption that if you, deter bad behavior, that the people will, as a kind of miracle, start to behaving in the right way. So I think recent research has shown that this assumption has its limitations, so to say.
Well, we'll come on to that in a minute. But Alan, what do you think about the reputation that regulation's got, maybe part of its past?
Yes, I think you might have even missed some items from that negative description of regulation, because it's often seen as red tape, bureaucratic, burdensome, and importantly, that it gets in the way of innovation and business success. In the eyes of some, possibly even many, that is how regulation is seen. But in the 21st century, I don't think it is a fair reflection. I think in more modern times, regulation is much more done with than done to, and it strives to be proportionate to risk. All that said, I do believe there's more that we can do to shift from that negative to a positive view of regulation and the way that regulation works. So getting away from checking and enforcement towards information, advice and guidance on how to meet standards. So I suppose ultimately less punitive and more preventative.
Yes, well, this is exactly what we are going to talk about now. So it's interesting that you raise that straight from the off. Before I come back to you, Martin, Alan, do you think that now in 2024, most regulators are thinking about their work in terms of being risk-based or principles-based, or is regulatory practice still harking back to that bureaucratic red tape model?
No, I don't think so. I think nearly all regulators would say their work is risk-based, although perhaps sometimes we can be better at specifying the risk of what, and it should be clear that this is the risk of harm. And some regulators aren't always that clear on the criteria that they use to assess risk. But overall, I'd say most regulators do a good job in this space, and therefore they address the need to be proportionate. That also applies to principles-based regulation, which moves away from the old model of top-down prescriptive approaches of old. I should, however, point out two challenges of risk-based regulation. The first is that it depends very much on the risk model used and the quality of data and information that goes into that model. So it is important that regulators keep their risk models under review. And the second, importantly, is that the risk tolerance of the regulator itself might not match that of the government or stakeholders or even the wider public. And we do see that playing out sometimes in stories of regulatory failure.
Right. Now, you've highlighted there that risk is quite a complex topic when applied to regulation, and that risk appetite may differ, not just within the regulator, but between the regulator and other stakeholders, including the government. So, Martin, listening to that, and before we move on to talk about systems thinking, what's your view of that description of risk-based regulation?
Yeah, it's interesting because we have actually a PhD student looking at the risks of risk-based regulation at the moment, which is a kind of meta-risk approach. I think risk management thinking can itself be a threat to a desired outcome. The idea that you can identify and analyze risks and put a number on it and then control it. That way of thinking could in itself be a risk, I would say. And the other thing is that, as Malcolm Sparrow already earlier pointed out, some of the time the regulated entities, the regulated organizations might be in a better position to analyze the risks themselves than the regulator, having less information about the technicalities around it. So I would say that, and maybe that's a bridge to the next topic of system-based regulation, but some of the complicated companies are in a better position to identify, analyze, and manage their risks than the regulator. And I sometimes see regulators be not too modest about their abilities to analyze risks and project that on the whole industry they are looking after. So,
well, very interesting. A difficult message, I think, for some of the regulators in the audience to hear that the regulated entities might understand risk better than them. Alan, as a regulated practitioner yourself, does that resonate with you?
It does to a certain extent, and it certainly aligns with some of the work that I've read that Martin has done on systems-based regulation. I think critically, probably the optimal model is not one side or the other, if I use that analogy, deciding what the risks are, but it is essentially working together in order to assess the risk. Maybe taking me back to my point about regulators being better at communicating about risk and using and explaining what criteria they use so that you can get that uniform view of risk, possibly that also bringing in other stakeholders, although it's always going to be a moving feast and it needs to be kept under review.
Well, you mentioned systems there. So, Martin, coming back to you, because I know that a number of academics, as well as some practitioners, have started to think about regulation in terms of systems. So, Martin, could you just tell us and listeners what do you think of as systems in a regulatory context?
Well, we've done some research in the healthcare industry and later on also in the chemical industry. And what we mean by system, in our definition of system-based regulation, is actually the management system of the regulated organization. So that is the collection of procedures, instructions, internal rules, and formalities within regulated organization in order to achieve their goals. So it's actually a operationalization of the goals of the organization into all kinds of measures and plans and procedures and instructions that should be in place to achieve their goals.
Okay, so that sounds a lot like good governance to me as well, in terms of understanding how things happen, procedures, stuff along those lines. Is that right?
I think that's basically the conception of it, and what we should be aware of is that it's still a paper reality. So it's still work as imagined, so to say. And one of the pitfalls of system-based regulation, I think, is that that regulators are looking at the paper reality and not looking at the physical reality and the gaps between those two. So we have done some research on that and developed a new model which addresses exactly that and invites regulators to look at the gaps between the goals, the system, on one side, on the paper side, and on the other side, the physical side, the actual conduct of the people in the organization and the physical result, the outcome, in terms of desired outcomes.
And is that what you sometimes refer to as meta-regulation?
Yes, I think so. So the meta-regulation is like a synonym for system-based regulation, as far as I'm concerned. And we're looking at the consistency within the regulated organization in terms of, are they walking their talk? Are they really translating their goals into a management system? Are they really actually executing that management system in a proper way and learning from practicalities and improve that system again? So that's a small PDCA loop between those two. And are they really looking at how the actual conduct is translated into actual results in terms of safety and quality and environmental protection or whatever the regulator might be interested in?
That's fantastic. That makes a lot of sense to me, I have to say, Martin. So, Alan, listening to that, what are your reflections on what Martin has just said about systems-based regulation and the gaps that might appear between what he calls a paper-based reality and the real reality? And how does that link with the model that I know that you've developed on right touch regulation? So maybe, Alan, you can just talk about some of those issues.
Yeah, well, of course, it's in the gaps where the harm tends to occur. So it is important to focus on those gaps. And picking on your point, Martial, about governance, the systems-based approach reminds me a lot of the 3 lines of defense model, which is commonly used to manage risk. So where the individual entity is the first line, the systems, in effect, here are the second line, and the regulator becomes the third line. So I've read some of Martin's work on decoupling and recoupling and public regulation. It's really interesting and useful stuff. But I think also it gives, going back to my earlier point, it gives a more positive role of regulators in the system. So you're shifting the focus from the frontline operations to the systems that maintain the quality of those operations and helping to improve them where needed. So that means that regulation itself becomes more proportionate, it becomes more agile, it supports flexibility and innovation. So there's a lot of parallels with right touch regulation. And it also enables regulators to take a step back and support greater self-regulation so that the safety net's still there, but the burdens are reduced, and it can encourage better systems, better governance, and so on. Yes, right touch regulation. I suppose the first thing I should say about that is that it's not a new idea. It's been used as a synonym for proportionality for a long time. But we have, at the Professional Standards Authority, built on the concept and developed our own right touch regulation model. We first published that in 2010. We updated it in 2015. And we're currently actually working on a third version to be published in September of next year. So this is a form of regulation which is principles-based. It builds on the better regulation themes, which I think we're all familiar around being proportionate and targeted and so on. But it does very importantly add agile, or as I like to think of it, responsive to change. Now, we all need to be agile and more agile because if you think about it, virtually all regulators are operating in a different environment to the one in which they were set up in. So they need to evolve to remain effective. And also, there are so many drivers of rapid change, whether that's AI or climate change or new drugs and devices in my world, workforce pressures, that we need to give regulated entities that ability to change, and the regulators themselves need to evolve. So it is, I think, a powerful and effective model. I do think, though, looking back at the 2015 version, that the model itself needs to change a little. We need more agility now because we're regulating for new risks. We need more stakeholder engagement, but we also need, quite critically, a much stronger focus on impact and outcomes.
Right, that's great. Well, goodness me, we look forward to seeing that when it comes out next year. But agility, I think, is really interesting because, as you say, the world is evolving very quickly, and every single regulator needs to make sure that its regulatory regime is kept up to date and responsive to those changes. As you say, not just AI, but demographic and other social changes. So, Martin, just listening there to what Alan has said about his model, that resonates, I think, with some of the things that you've been saying as well.
Yes, I completely agree with what Alan says, and I'm very much looking forward to the new version of his approach. The other thing I wanted to add to that is the agility is very important, especially in a time where the society is getting more and more complex, and also that brings the notion that predictability of applying rules and expecting a certain societal result or effect is not so obvious anymore in complex situations. So the regulator and inspectors, should carry out the regulation, but that's not a guarantee for the societal effect that is proposed. And I found that system-based regulation gives more flexibility in terms of situational risk management instead of compliance as the higher goal. In my world, it is more important to reach that societal effect, which was intended to be the result of that regulations, than compliance as the highest goal. So. Yeah. I agree very much, but we should be aware that the regulators come into a different position then. It's not only executing the law and regulations anymore, but it's also thinking about in every different situations, it's a different consideration, I think, what is giving the best societal result in this situation. And that's brings them sometimes in a difficult position because they're not backed up by the hard letter of the law, but they should improvise in every situation.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking exactly the same because this approach to regulation, which requires agility and judgment, puts a much bigger burden on frontline regulators because they can't just rely on a tick box in a form and to say, well, you can tick those boxes and therefore you've passed, you comply, because actually it's a much more dynamic process where they need to use their judgment to determine, as you say, what's the right outcome in that particular set of circumstances, which is unlikely to have been predicted by the law. So can either of you come up with some, because we could, I'm sure, find some examples of bad practice, but we don't want to do that. We want to find some good practice that people listening to this podcast can look to see if there are organizations, regulators that are doing this well, in your view. Martin, do you have any examples that you can think of?
Yeah, I think so. We've done a case study on the aviation regulation, and their system-based regulation is de facto in use since the 60s, I think, in development, but still. And I think it's always hard to find hard evidence for a certain regulation approach and the actual outcome. But there's much to say that system-based regulation has led to an impressive safety performance in the aviation industry. Yeah. Just because regulators left the responsibility for safety at the companies and how to organize and how to assure that. So I think that's a quite obvious example.
That's really interesting, and certainly the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK is, is, in my view, a very good regulator and one to be looked at for the models that it's deployed. Alan, in your experience, are there good examples of system-based or right touch regulation?
Yes, I think the first thing I'd say is that another great advantage of systems-based regulation is that the systems are there, well, maybe not quite, but pretty much 24/7. Whereas regulatory oversight is almost definitely just periodic. And another point about it, it's closer to the problem. And one of the principles of right touch regulation is to get as close to the problem as possible. I'll be very circumspect in talking about my own organization as a model of good practice. But on reflection, I think we do use forms of systems-based regulation in our reviews of regulator performance. So we use our standards of good regulation for this. And we've got a standard, for example, for the quality assurance of education and training that the professional regulators use. We've also got another standard for the systems which underpin professional development and continuing fitness to practice. And another one for the effectiveness of fitness to practice as a whole. I suspect, actually, if I've reflected on that others can do so, and that a number of regulators will be using some form of systems-based regulation. They might just not call it that, and they may not have looked at, the strengths and limitations of it as part of their regulatory toolkit, if you want. But I think there's a lot we can learn from this.
That's great. And so thinking now about those listening to the podcast who are working in different regulators and different sectors, what are the key things that they ought to be thinking about in their own roles when they're thinking about their world in terms of systems-based regulation? Martin, do you want to give us some clues?
I would say not every industry is suitable, or not every regulated company or organization is suitable for this approach, because it's based on the assumption that there is some kind of capacity for self-regulation within the regulated organization. And if it's not there, if companies are not willing or not able to assure a certain outcome in a professional way, then it wouldn't make sense to put a lot of effort in that. But as organizations grow bigger, they have to develop some kind of management system in order to organize themselves and achieve their goals. And that management system is a perfect stepping stone for system-based regulation, as far as I'm concerned, because you can use all these dynamics and PDCA cycles and so on in order to also assure a certain societal desired outcome. So if an industry has some degree of professionalism and ethics, I would say, then there's a critical mass of that in that industry. I would say system-based regulation can have a important contribution.
Okay, so you're saying that that regulators need to rely in part on the ethical standards of the regulated community. And perhaps for larger companies that they've got a compliance team or others who are making sure that the organization is complying with the law as well. So,
yes, yeah.
So relying on that first line of defense, as Alan put it earlier on. Alan, so that's what the regulated entities can do. What about other players in the regulatory world? So I'm thinking of government, parliament, and other stakeholders who can help move regulatory regimes more to the right touch or systems-based thinking?
Yes, I suppose if I was thinking initially about government and parliament, what I would be recommending is that in general, I mean, there is some expertise in that area, but government and parliament should know more, first of all, about regulation. It's categorically not a one-size-fits-all prescriptive set of burdensome rules. And also to think about regulation as a solution to challenging problems, not something that gets in the way. So where regulation, good regulation at least, can encourage innovation, it can support economic development. And you might expect me to say this, but I would also hope that government and parliament would encourage all regulators to work in a right touch manner. And I've already said there are a lot of synergies and overlaps with the systems approach. Interestingly, I know the new government we have here in the UK have talked before about having some sort of regulatory oversight function. And I think thinking about things like systems-based regulation and right touch regulation should be a core role for an oversight body such as that.
Interesting. Yes. As you say, the new Labour government here in the UK has proposed to set up what they call a regulatory innovation office. And that will focus in part on technological solutions to help regulators to do their jobs. But maybe also one of the things it can think about is methodological issues, such as the ones that we're talking about here. So, Martin, coming back to you, those regulators who are listening to this and they want to find out more about systems thinking, regulation, and the right kind of approach to adopt going forward, for their organisations, where should they go? What would you advise them to do?
Well, I think there's a bunch of articles about this. And there's a saying that nothing is as practical as a good theory. So there's a bunch of publications, and I think the publications of Alan and ourselves working in this field are worthwhile as a start to get some ideas. But those publications are not only very theoretical, but also quite practical. And there are all kinds of examples of system-based regulations in different settings that can be maybe an inspiration to some of our listeners.
Excellent. Okay, well, we'll make sure that some of those are linked from the Institute of Regulation website, which is ioregulation.org, for those of you who want to follow up. Alan, coming back to you then, thinking about the UK context and also the role of the Institute of Regulation, where we're here to support the profession and to help it understand some of these challenges, which are consistent across different regulatory sectors. What are the kind of tips that you would give to colleagues thinking about these issues and wanting to do more?
Well, you've just given a good plug to the IRR website. So I think I'd do the same on right touch regulation. The obvious starting place, at least, is to go to the PSA website. But as I've mentioned, we're currently developing a new version of right touch regulation for publication in the autumn of next year. And I think actually we could work together. We could provide some information on how that's developing through IOR newsletters and events over the next few months. And actually that'll be a really good opportunity for us to get some feedback on that to make sure it's going in the right direction and covering what people need. Because ultimately, at this time next year, what I want is something that all regulators, regardless of sector or jurisdiction, will find very relevant and very useful.
Great. Well, I'm completely with you on that, Alan. And I very much hope that that what we've started to talk about here is the kind of conversations that all regulators will be having over the coming years, because I think it's evident from this conversation that the regulatory world is moving away from that old top-down inspectorate-based approach to something which is much more consistent with the complex world that we live in, and recognizing the dynamism of the regulated landscape and the fact that regulators too need to be agile, as you said earlier on, Alan, and use their judgment and be responsive to the changes around them. So let's hope that we have more conversations like this in future. Thank you very much to both of you. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It even found it a little bit exciting for us regulation geeks, as I said. So thank you, Alan Clamp from the Professional Standards Authority and Martin de Bree from the Erasmus University in the Netherlands. Thanks also to our sound engineer, Neil Bowerman of Bowerman Audio Productions. And thank you to you listening as well. I hope you found the discussion interesting. And if you have, do let your colleagues know about it. Tune into future podcasts where we will discuss other issues of interest to regulators. Next one's on communications as a regulatory tool. You can find other material and events on the website, as I've mentioned. So thank you again for listening to me, Martial Bou at the Regulation Podcast. Good luck with your own regulatory challenges and stay in touch with each other and with the Institute to help UK regulation become the best it can. Thank you very much and goodbye.